As we continue our study in the book of Genesis, this video, we're going to turn to one of the most intriguing, complex, and deeply human figures in the entire Old Testament, Jacob. In our previous lectures, we looked at Abraham's journey from anxious intervention to restful trust. And as we move on to the next generation, we meet a man whose early life is defined not by giant leaps of faith, but by relentless scheming, manipulation, and theft. Despite his deeply profound character flaws, Jacob is a pivotal character in biblical theology. In fact, by the end of his story, his new name will define the very covenant people of God for the rest of history. In this video, we're going to examine the anatomy of a deceiver, tracing how a deeply flawed usurper, Jacob, is confronted by grace, dismantled in the dark, and transformed into a blueprint for a nation. Before we dive into the specific narrative details, let's look at the big picture on this slide here. Jacob's personal trajectory is not just an individual biography, it's a symbolic archetype for the nation of Israel itself throughout Old Testament history. Notice three distinct phases that define his life. Flaw. He begins with a life characterized by striving, trickery, self-reliance, constantly trying to secure blessing and gain through human manipulation. But then promise. Right in the middle of his bad behavior, God meets him with an unearned, unmerited covenant promise. And then crisis. Finally, he's brought to a dark night of the soul encounter. This agony in the middle of the night, a literal wrestling match with God that shatters his self-sufficiency and gives him a brand new identity. So this three-part paradigm, flaw, promise, and crisis, is the exact pattern Israel as a nation as well will repeat through Exodus, the wilderness, the kings, and the exile. And so Jacob, even in sharing a name, is more than just sharing that name, but is a picture of Israel himself. So let's start where the text starts in his story, with his name. In ancient Near Eastern literature, especially in biblical literature, a person's name isn't just a random arbitrary label. It functions as a disclosure, tells us something about a character and destiny of that person. So in Genesis 25, twin brothers are born to Rebekah. The firstborn comes out red and covered in hair, so they call him Esau. It just means hairy, like having lots of hair. But as the second twin emerges, the baby's hand is tightly grasping his brother's heel, so they name him Jacob. In Hebrew, this literally means heel grabber. Now, there's a lot of things we could say about this, but I think the most concise explanation comes in the Theological Word Book of the Old Testament, where it points out that heel grabber is a well-known ancient Hebrew idiom. It refers to someone who comes up behind you to kind of kick your feet out from under you, a trip artist, a usurper, a deceiver, someone who's trying to trip you up. And it came over time to be kind of synonymous with the word deceiver. So from the moment he enters the world, Jacob is marked as a man who moves through his life trying to trip others up and deceive them to get ahead. The contrast between Jacob and his twin brother Esau is captured really brilliantly in Genesis 25 through the famous story of the stew. So if we look at how the author uses Hebrew style to paint these two personalities, we can view them side by side. So this isn't necessarily super obvious in the English, but in the Hebrew, it's kind of funny. On one side, you have Esau. You kind of maybe think of him as the dumb, hairy one. In the Hebrew text, this is actually shown through his gruff, impulsive nature. Even when he speaks, he stumbles in, exhausted from hunting. His dialogue is a bunch of just short, almost animal phrases. He literally says, "Let me gulp down some of that red." He speaks in very short sentences and doesn't say much. He's driven by immediate short-term physical appetite. But on the other side, you have Jacob, the calculating heel grabber, the deceiver. While Esau is ruled by his stomach, Jacob is cool, strategic, he's opportunistic. Seeing his brother's vulnerability because he's so hungry, Jacob instantly weaponizes this stew that he's got, forcing Esau to trade away his right as the firstborn on the spot. So Esau squanders his legacy over a meal, and Jacob shamelessly exploits him to steal it. The incident with the stews, just the only opening entry in Jacob's long ledger of stolen blessings. So as we look at Genesis 27, Jacob escalates from exploiting his brother to outright deliberate fraud against his old blind father Isaac. So he stole the birthright by trading for firstborn rights. Jacob, that means that he would receive 2/3 of the massive family estate in inheritance, leaving Esau with 1/3. Now, it should be that Esau receives 2/3 and Jacob 1/3, but he's traded for that stew the ability to have more of that birthright. And now he does something else. He steals a blessing. Dressed in Esau's clothes and wearing goat skins on his arms to make him more hairy, Jacob lies directly to his father's face, impersonating his brother to steal this special blessing and spiritual authority. Now, we don't know necessarily exactly what this means, but it's clear that it is something very important that has some kind of binding sense to it, and he steals that as well. So Jacob achieves his goals, but the cost is devastating. He leaves Esau hollowed out and furious. Esau's so angry because his brother's basically stolen everything. So threatened with murder, Jacob is forced to abandon his home, his mother, and his land, and he flees into exile as a fugitive. Which brings us to Genesis 28, another really key scene in the book of Genesis, and one of the most remarkable moments in Jacob's narrative. So night falls on the lonely road that he's on. Jacob is out in the middle of nowhere, no home, no protection, no family. So he picks up a stone, he sets it under his head as a pillow, and falls asleep in the dirt. So consider this for a moment. Um, Jacob hasn't repented of anything. He's not seeking God. He's not looking for forgiveness. He's just a fugitive running away from the consequences of his own deceptions. Yet there in the wilderness, God gives a vision to Jacob that he didn't ask for, he didn't earn, and he isn't even really qualified to receive. So we have a really big word here, big phrase. In his dream, Jacob sees a structure stretching between heaven and earth. In English Bibles, traditionally translate the Hebrew word here, which is shulam, as ladder or stairway. But linguistically, this word is what we call a hapax legomenon. This is a really technical term, but it just means a word that appears only once in the entire Hebrew Bible or in a work of literature. We can use it for other things, words that occur maybe only once in the works of Shakespeare. We would also call a hapax legomenon, and sometimes it's just called a hapax for short. So when a word like this only occurs once, it's difficult to know how to translate it because there's no way to compare it to other passages. So translators usually look to related ancient Near Eastern languages, Semitic cognates languages, to help understand what it means, because maybe those languages have similar words that can help us understand what this word means. And when we look at ancient Akkadian cognates, this word that's here doesn't mean like a wooden household ladder. It definitely doesn't mean that. So a lot of times you'll see a staircase or something like that. It's because this word in the Akkadian means like a stepped ramp or like a stair tower, what we would call a ziggurat, like a pyramid, almost like the Tower of Babel that we talked about before. So why is that so important to make connections in the biblical narrative? Because if Jacob is seeing a ziggurat in his dream, then Genesis 28 is intentionally designed as this brilliant literary inversion of the Tower of Babel from Genesis 11. So if you remember in Genesis 11 at Babel, the rebellious humans take the initiative. They try to build a ziggurat, a tower upward to force their way into heaven, to the gate of the gods, because they're trying to have significance and security. But the result is judgment, confusion, and scattering. But here at Bethel, in Genesis 28, God's the one that takes the initiative. He reaches downward to this sleeping, lying fugitive, Jacob. Jacob doesn't build a tower up to reach God. He's not even looking for God, but God opens heaven and comes down to meet Jacob in the middle of his ruin and his mistakes. So Bethel is grace that turns Babel upside down in many ways. So as God stands at the top of the structure in Jacob's dream, he speaks. He passes the covenant to Abraham on to Jacob, land, nation, and blessing. He passes it directly to him, just like it was passed to Isaac. He repeats it again. But then God also adds something additional, a personalized promise, specifically for the terrified fugitive running in the dark. He says, "Behold, I am with you, and I will keep you wherever you go." Because remember, Jacob is not in his own land. This is an important theological expansion. The promise of land, nation, and blessing, God now adds the promise of presence. I will be with you. In this theme, God's personal, enduring presence, being with his flawed people, is going to drive the rest of the entire Old Testament narrative from Moses at the burning bush all the way to the tabernacle and the temple, and even onto God dwelling with his people in the form of Jesus in the New Testament. And it all begins right here with the deceiver. So, how does Jacob respond to the vision in unmerited favor and grace that he's given? Does he fall on his face repenting like Abraham in repenting worship, or building an altar like Abraham and Isaac did? No. You have to look at what he says in Genesis 28. In what he does, especially. When Abraham and Isaac received God's promise, they build altars, a very specific word, to worship the one true God. But this text says that Jacob sets up a standing stone, a different Hebrew word, a term in the Old Testament and other places, especially in Deuteronomy, that is associated with pagan, kind of transactional shrines. The law actually tells the Israelites they are not supposed to build these kinds of things. So Jacob utters a vow, but notice what he says there. He says, if God will be with me and keep me, and if he gives me bread to eat and clothing to wear, then the Lord shall be my God. So even after seeing heaven opened, Jacob treats the Almighty God like a business partner. Instead of just accepting this unmerited gift, he sets up this kind of transactional standing stone, and then he tries to negotiate a conditional contract. You perform first, God, and then I'll consider allowing you to be my God. So we move forward in Jacob's life, and we are skipping some parts here for sure, but about 20 years pass, and Jacob lives in Haran. He gets his own taste of it, a taste of his own medicine from his deceitful father-in-law, who deceives Jacob as well in his wife. When he's seeking Rachel, he gets Leah instead. But through all of this, God actually prospers him and eventually commands Jacob to return home, which brings us to Genesis 32, which is just as Genesis 22 is like the climax of Abraham's story. Genesis 32 is the climax and kind of crisis point of Jacob's life. Jacob is returning to Canaan, but news arrives that Esau is riding out to meet him with 400 armed men. So, of course, Jacob is terrified. He splits his camp. He sends his family and possessions ahead of him across the river and stays behind, which doesn't show a whole lot of courage, sending the weak, defenseless people first. And then in Genesis 32:24, we read some heavy words. It says, "And Jacob was left alone." No family to hide behind, no schemes that he has left to execute, no tricks left in his bag. And in the pitch black of the night, a mysterious stranger suddenly tackles him. He wrestles with him. They don't speak a word. They just wrestle violently until the break of dawn. And as dawn begins to break, the divine stranger that Jacob realizes is God, because after the whole encounter, he says, "Surely I've seen God face to face." The stranger touches Jacob's hip socket, instantly dislocating it. But even when he's limping in agony, Jacob grips the stranger and cries, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Which is interesting because God has already blessed him. He's already given him this promise. Jacob's already stolen blessings from Esau, but here he is trying again to secure a blessing from God by wrestling. And the stranger asks a question. He says, "What is your name?" Think about the weight of that question. 20 years earlier, when his blind father Isaac asks, "Who are you, my son?" Jacob lies and he says, "I'm Esau, your firstborn son." And he stole that blessing under a false name. But here in the dark, he's confronted by God himself. Jacob finally drops his mask. He stops pretending to be someone else, and he says his real name. He says Jacob. And this is more than just about a name. Remember, this is about who he is. He's confessing, "I am the heel grabber. I'm the deceiver. I'm the one who trips people up." For the first time, we get this sense and this narrative that he's confessing who he truly is, and he's doing it honestly. In the moment that Jacob confesses who, God takes that old identity and rebuilds him right there on that spot. He says, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." The name Israel means one who strives with God, okay? One who walks with God, one who wrestles with God. Look at that transformation. He spent 50 years striving against people through deceit. Now he turns to pour his energy to striving with God through a persistent, clinging faith. And we're going to see that his even though he keeps making some mistakes, he does have life change here. As the sun rises, Israel, now no longer Jacob, he crosses the river. He's limping permanently. He has this physical mark that he can no longer rely on his own strength, but he walks across the river transformed and a changed man. So stand back and consider the profound grace in this story. God's covenant people are not named the Abrahamites after the heroic father. They're not named the Isaacites after the obedient son. They're named Israel after the self-centered, scheming deceiver who was brought to the end of himself and confessed his brokenness in the darkness and allowed God to break and remake him. Jacob's life is the ultimate comfort for anyone who feels too flawed for God to use. God doesn't call the equipped. He dismantles the people who are self-sufficient and transforms them through his grace. So in Genesis 33, we immediately see the fruit of his transformation as Israel now walks across the river to meet Esau. He stops fighting God, surrenders his life to divine sovereignty. He faces his fear of Esau head on. Instead of fleeing or hiding behind his family, he makes restitution by presenting gifts to Esau to restore what he'd stolen. And he rests in unmerited blessing that he spent the first half of his life trying to manipulate and steal. And we actually see late on in his story, he goes back to Bethel and he, instead of putting up a standing stone, it actually says that he builds an altar there. So he goes back and corrects the previous error that he made as well. The story of Jacob is not a moral lesson in how to get ahead in life by being super smart and deceiving. It's a story of how God's persistent grace pursues after this deceiver, and he breaks his self-reliance and turns the deceiver, the heel grabber, into Israel. And as we move forward into the next story of Joseph and his brothers, you got to keep this in mind to see how God continues to work through this broken family and preserve his covenant promises.